Hello, I'm Annabelle Lee, and welcome back to another episode of the Talking Classical podcast. My guest today is Emily Pailthorpe. Emily is an internationally renowned oboist who also practices as a psychotherapist, seeing clients for the NHS and at the Door Clinic in Chiswick, as well as online in private practice. I spoke to Emily in June when we talked about her versatile work in oboe playing and psychotherapy, and how both areas relate to each other. This led us to discuss a range of topics such as the healing power of music, mental health and well-being, breathwork, and two pieces Emily has recorded, Britten's 6 Metamorphoses after Ovid and Vaughan Williams' great art song Silent Noon, arranged for oboe and piano. These two works speak to the psyche and the great emotive sway music has on both player and listener. The full film for Britten's 6 Metamorphoses after Ovid will be premiered on Emily's YouTube channel on the 10th of January 2024. So go to the description box below this podcast for a link where you can subscribe to Emily's YouTube channel for the release and be the first to know when to watch the film. Can you start off by just telling us a little bit about yourself and your journey into music? Do you come from a musical family?
So my name is Emily Pailthorpe,
and
I'm an oboist, and my gateway into music was through the recorder, which I started at a very early age.
Nice.
I don't come from a musical family. I come from a family of teachers. And my mum was really keen that we had music. So when she'd had a lot of music playing around the house, and she asked what would be a great instrument to start on, and this recorder, which I still think is a fantastic way into music because it's
definitely
so direct and easy, and you get the breath
right
away, and it doesn't take long because the technique is so simple. It doesn't take long for you to go from playing notes to playing music.
Yeah, definitely. And there's so much transference, isn't there? If you play the recorder, like you can go to playing like the flute or the oboe because the fingerings are very similar, aren't they?
Yeah. So then I remember hearing a recording of Beethoven 5 and hearing the oboe.
Yes.
And I was about 11. And that was it. I knew that was what I wanted to do with my life. So I started the oboe at 11 and that was, just went from one thing to the next.
Yeah. I mean, did you know that, you were going to make the oboe your career? Because I see that you trained at a number of excellent music schools here in the UK and over in the US. You were obviously, destined to, do music from a very young age. Or was it something that kind of came quite naturally?
Yeah. Honestly, from the minute I heard the sound of the oboe, I knew that was what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And so my parents were due to go on sabbatical to the UK. I'm from Minnesota in the States. And because they thought I was too old to sort of tag along this time while they were on sabbatical, they'd put me into a British school, a British boarding school. And I was
This was the Purcell, wasn't it?
No, this was a school on the Welsh borders.
Okay.
And I was very unhappy there, mainly because I had just been at the Interlochen summer music camp on the oboe, and I was just so raring to go. So in October, they took me up for an audition at the Purcell School, and I transferred there, and then ended up staying and doing my O-levels before going back to the States and transferring to the Interlochen Arts Academy, where I finished high school. But at that point, I was so certain that I was going to work as a musician that partly through my parents' encouragement, I decided to go to university first. And I was lucky because the university I went to, Yale University, not only had an amazing orchestra, to rival sort of any of the conservatories, but also is very close to New York City. So I was able to go and have lessons at Juilliard and attend Juilliard oboe class at the same time that I was at Yale. And that was a great way to really focus on my music while still getting a university degree.
If you're comfortable talking about this, it's interesting that you said that when you were at the boarding school in Wales, you said you didn't have a great time. And I think a lot of young kids, I think, who love classical music, I think find it very hard. I think maybe being in a normal school. So I imagine that when you went to the Purcell, it must have been like a haven for you, just being surrounded by all these, like-minded children who had the same passion as you.
Oh, that's absolutely true. I mean, I remember walking into the school.
Yeah.
At that point, it was on Harrow Hill and a sort of old house.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
You hear people walking up down the stairs singing.
Yeah.
We started every day by singing Bach chorales.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it was an amazing training.
Yeah. I mean, this is something it's been in the news quite recently, hasn't it? But I think it's just such a shame that the schools here in the UK maybe don't put as much emphasis on, music and the arts. Maybe, if all schools started off their day by singing a Bach chorale, maybe if our government, started each day by singing a Bach chorale, perhaps things would be a bit better,
You're not wrong. Sort of my most recent endeavor has been to train as a psychotherapist. So I'm now working as an oboist in all the facets of being an oboist, but also as a psychotherapist. And in finishing my degree, I wrote my dissertation on how musicians who have experienced psychotherapy use music to access and process emotion. Oh. And the results that came out of this were much deeper than I had appreciated when I went into this. Totally. And the real takeaways are that music is an incredibly powerful tool to facilitate relationship, to deepen relationship, to transcend boundaries and barriers of difference, even of class difference. It's an incredibly uniting and relationally powerful tool. And it creates connection and depth. So everything you say about the importance of it throughout society, whether we're musicians or not, especially in the time right now that we have of a great mental health crisis, is true.
Well, let's move on to your work then in psychotherapy. Was this quite a recent decision of yours? Have you always been interested in psychotherapy, or was this something prompted by the lockdown?
I've always been interested in how we process emotion.
Yeah.
So essentially, I view music as a language. I have since I picked up the oboe. I think the oboe has a really special sound that calls
very
both composers,
very vocal.
That calls composers and performers alike. Before we started the interview, you were saying about how difficult it looks to play the oboe, and it's true. And I do think that's one of the important things about the instrument is it's almost we have to pull out the sound. It's something that is defying it.
So for the purposes of our listeners, effectively, you're like, it's like biting on your thumb, isn't it? Like you're biting on a reed, isn't
like
it?
Sort of blowing down blowing up a balloon.
Oh, okay.
So a reed is a double reed like a bassoon, and it's got a small opening. And so you are blowing into essentially a very small space, which means that it's not like the flute or the clarinet where you use up all your air. As oboists, we have to expel air before we inhale again. So it's quite unique. But this sort of defying thing we do to create this sort of unique sound, I think, is part of what makes it feel like the human voice, and what is part of the reason that composers reach to it for really poignant, amazing, often very difficult moments in music. It's used to portray all sorts of grief and sadness and longing and poignancy. So getting back to your question, I'm sure that there was something that drew me to the oboe, because I was very interested in how we process emotion. And in my work as an oboist, this was always something I came back to. So when the pandemic hit and all the concerts were cancelled, it wasn't a ginormous step to decide to retrain as a psychotherapist, and to broaden the sort of portfolio of my work.
I mean, it's a bit frustrating because I'm sure you're probably aware of, there was a big hoo-ha about, Rishi Sunak saying that artists should retrain, to go into different careers, which of course is complete baloney. But at the same time, being able to broaden your skills and diversify into other areas that are also connected to music as well and have another career, I think it's so helpful because it just makes you a more rounded person. And you said that there were so many different similarities between oboe playing and psychotherapy.
Well, that's the funny thing is, I started this degree expecting that I would keep my music and my psychotherapy quite separate.
Yeah.
But what I realized quite early on was that one of the things studying psychotherapy was doing for me was highlighting and defining how valuable music is.
Yeah.
So one of the big takeaways from studying psychotherapy is that it's helped me define why I'm an artist and why that is vitally important to me, and why art and music are vitally important to the world, whether we are musicians or not.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the things that you've taken away then from your work as a psychotherapist that maybe you can now apply as an oboist? I imagine that one of the things is probably the people skills. And I mean, does it make you more empathetic, I suppose, maybe as a teacher as well?
Interesting. I guess the biggest takeaway from psychotherapy to music, because there have been many from music to psychotherapy, but I think the biggest from psychotherapy to music is really defining for me that, I really view the world in a sort of humanistic way. I think that we all have the ability within ourselves to become the sort of fully functioning person that we're meant to be. And that then creates this sort of situation where, as the therapist, you want to provide a sort of holding, reparative relationship, a holding environment in which you can really hear your client. And I think this is translated for me into the way I am in relationship, the way I meet people, probably especially my children, as not viewing that I need to rush in and fix them or change them or provide information, more that I'm creating a space in which they can optimally grow. That's a bit different when you're teaching oboe technique, because no one is magically going to learn how to make a reed or magically know exactly how to support and all the sort of things that you can teach as a teacher. But in terms of really putting the locus with the person to find their way and for you to be a support, that's how that's informed my stance.
There was that wonderful interpretation of Silent Noon you did.
Yes.
Vaughan Williams. And you said in your video that you kind of made it as a song without words. What does that piece mean to you? And,
Yeah, I mean, it's based on the Rossetti poem, and it sits in Vaughan Williams's song cycle, The House of Life. But I think it is one of the most extraordinary songs because the poem talks about this sort of, she calls it an inarticulate hour, where just finding the space with the other was a moment of peace. And so to me, it really illustrates in Vaughan Williams's music that music can create for us, especially live performance, this moment when we're really able to be present and we're really able to be in the moment. And I think that's something that people really struggle to find, and music can be a way to really ground ourselves. And that piece in particular, I think, takes us just into that experience of really being in the moment because it's so transcendental.
And I imagine that because you recorded it, obviously without words. So does it take on kind of a different meaning then when you record it without words? I mean, or are you obviously you have to be very conscious, of the words as you, blow through the instrument?
Well, I'm constantly,
or the lyrical line, right?
I'm blown away again and again by the ability of music to convey emotion, even without words.
Yeah.
So, as I was playing that, I was thinking the words for me, but I also was recognizing the fact that without the words, the music takes flight and it conveys something. I mean, I remember hearing the Finzi interlude for the first time and understanding without knowing the deep grief and this deep sort of sense of trying to escape from fate that piece conveys. And then when I went and read up on Finzi, I was not surprised to hear the history that he'd endured.
So he was in a psychiatric ward, wasn't he?
Well, and he'd lost, many people in the war, and his wife was suffering from cancer. And, and this, for me, sitting, in the Midwest in America, hearing this piece of music decades later with no words, that was clear as could be. It is a profound, profound language. I mean, another example of that is the Britten Metamorphoses after Ovid, which is sort of one of our seminal pieces on the oboe.
Yes.
There's six short pieces, each depicting a metamorphosis. And I was recently commissioned by the Haworth oboe makers to create a piece about this, which was about mental health. And it was quite a funny story because I was all set to record this to go on the YouTube channel as a beautiful rendition of the piece in a sort of gallery with Greek statues, and this was all going to be what you might expect.
Yeah.
And they said, these sort of forward thinking leaders at Haworth wrote to me and said, "Couldn't you create a film about mental health instead?" To which the answer might have been, probably not in the time frame, except that when the email came through, I was sitting with my daughter, who is a filmmaker director, just starting out, and we started batting this idea back and forth. And what I did was get out my oboe and play these metamorphoses to her, and then without reading Britten's captions for each one, because he had sort of 2 lines just depicting the myth to each one.
Yeah.
So then she and I both wrote down the emotional metamorphosis that we heard in each piece, and we got exactly the same one for us. So we decided we were onto something there, and we ended up making a film which isn't the story of the myths. It's the emotional journey of each movement. So that was really interesting.
Yeah. But also I found it interesting in your video as well that you chose to reinterpret it from, I suppose, the feminist perspective, and that you made the protagonist a female who, goes on, I suppose, her own metamorphosis. And of course, culminating in that scene at the end where, she discovers you as, her mother. And that's just such a poignant moment for me when I was watching it in both a figurative and a literal sense. I mean, it's just, it was a really interesting take on it, very modern.
Yeah, and I think it's probably important to say for the listeners, you had a sneak preview.
Yeah,
it hasn't been released yet. Yeah. But if they're interested in that, then it will be released on my YouTube channel. So if they subscribe to the YouTube channel, they'll get an alert when it comes out.
Right.
But just getting back to what you were saying, yes, it was supposed to be a journey from grief to finding flow, and a comment on how music can lead us there. In the first metamorphosis in Pan, she almost can't engage with the music. She blocks it out because it's too much to pull her. And then, and then the story unfolds from there. But yes, there was something about taking it away, taking these incredible pieces away from these sort of archaic myths where, men are chasing women that have to turn themselves into fountains. That was quite a relief. Yes, it was.
It was really cool as well, because you did allude, I don't know, you allude as well, I suppose, to, classical imagery in the film, with things like the funeral pyre, when she's eating the grapes, the abacuses, the gardens. So yeah.
Yes, you got it all.
Yes,
it's great.
Yeah. Well,
we loaded in a bunch of sort of symbolism there for people who know the myths and are interested. Yeah. Well, and you will have seen we took then Ovid text, which is from the myths but isn't in the Britten, and added it in the film. And that was neat too.
Yeah. I mean, those Ovid texts are just so rich, aren't they? And just just full of kind of love. Almost very sensual in a way, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely, as the music is.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing that was great about that project is that, of course, Britten wrote numerous film scores. So it made a lot of sense for the Metamorphoses to become a film score.
Emily, I know that you work for the NHS and at the Door Clinic as well as privately online. So what does a typical day look like for you as a psychotherapist?
So, in a typical day, I'd have anywhere between 3 and 6 clients seen either face to face or on Zoom. Mm-hmm. And I think Zoom therapy is really powerful. Oh. It's a lot. I was interestingly speaking to an Alexander Technique teacher last week.
Yeah.
When I was working at Interlaken, who was saying, they thought, how on earth are we going to teach Alexander Technique on Zoom? And I thought, how am I going to teach oboe on Zoom? But we did, and we got a lot out of it. But Great. Psychotherapy is something where Zoom psychotherapy is amazing and has many advantages over face-to-face therapy, in that therapy is really about the client uncovering their unconscious process. And for me, my integrative take has a lot to do with the different parts of our personality and how those relate to each other. I mean, if you want to put it in musical terms, we have all these different parts to our personality, and we ourselves sit at the center as a conductor. And when it's going well, all the parts are playing together and complement each other. And there's a sort of unity. But that can quite easily be thrown off to where there's great discord, and that's where therapy comes in. But Zoom therapy is very powerful because the person can be in their own home or someplace they're very comfortable. There's much less of needing to suss me out and suss out my environment. And it can be much more about them.
And if they want to turn their camera off as well, if they feel maybe uncomfortable talking to a person, then
that's interesting. I haven't been asked that yet, and I'm not sure how that would work. So far, there's always been the connection, but I will say for sort of high achieving, very busy people, it's also very liberating because they can just pop into an office, have their hour online.
Exactly.
And that's fantastic. And they don't have to have the travel to, the waiting, the travel back from. So I think, and also, it means that you can see clients in very different places. It doesn't have to all be, within your traveling radius. It really opens things up.
Yeah. You specialize mainly in working, is it with creatives?
Yeah, so my target client would be the sort of highly successful, highly creative who's sort of run into a brick wall. And we often find that sort of defense mechanisms, we have ways we've gotten things to work, sort of there comes a point when those run out, when it can become incredibly exhausting. So we may be performing at a peak level, but just utterly exhausted by what we're having to do to do that. And that can be a point where it's incredibly helpful and healing to engage with therapy and to understand exactly what our process is, and maybe come to understand things from our past which are informing how we are acting in the present or how we're interpreting the present, and to sort of liberate ourselves from that so that we can actually be in the present, living and working in the present and not dictated to by our past.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things that I could talk about from there. I mean, I guess the first point that, just came into my head is, because the word burnout has just become, a bit of a buzzword over the last couple of years, but let's not underestimate that this is actually it's a real thing. And I think obviously, the pandemic showed that actually I think a lot of musicians were very relieved to have a break, and then I think the second thing.
Just your first point though is a really valid one. I mean, I was surprised to hear by even musicians who I thought were the most sort of, travel hungry, concert hungry, that they were really relieved, when the concerts were cancelled. And what does that say about us, that we long for space?
Yeah.
And often when someone's engaged with therapy, their life doesn't look very different from the outside when they come out, but it feels incredibly different.
Yeah.
That's the thing is, and I found this in my dissertation as well. I was interviewing high achieving, fabulous performers and would have had no idea how exhausting to them what they were doing was.
Yeah. Well, the second point has come back to me now. And I mean, it's just, I think it's this thing that, I think often musicians carry a lot of emotion with them, whether they're singers or instrumentalists, and particularly as wind players, it's so evident when you hear someone who is carrying a lot of stress in their breath and that in their body. And
well, and there's also something about, why do we become artists? Why are we artists? And why do we, engage in a career that is so challenging, that demands hours and hours of meticulous practice, and
especially at the level that
putting
you play
our vulnerability on the line. Yes. And as an oboist, making reeds, and it's because we get something from music. It helps us process something. And so, one of the things that really came out of the study that I did was that music for the musician is therapy. Music, it's a safe place. Like, you can put the CD back in the box. The concert comes to an end. It's a contained space in which we can engage with really deep emotion that we don't necessarily have to have the lived experience to correlate with. You can be plunged into the depths of despair in Tchaikovsky, and you don't have to, or Finzi, and you don't have to have been in the trenches, or experienced the sort of lived experience that these people had. So it's a place, and also it allows us to process emotion almost unconsciously when we don't have to put actual words to it. We're able to turn our thinking mind off and really work things out in our unconscious. And it's made me aware of how I use music. I mean, sometimes I'll be thinking about something, and then I'll notice that I've got a piece of music in my head that's related to it. And my mind is making all these connections that when I do them through music, it's a smoother way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, it's always really funny, isn't it? Whenever you have like an earworm in your head, or you have like a melody, or like even like a movement from a symphony or something like that, and you just keep replaying it in your head, and then you just like, I don't know, it's a strange feeling, isn't it?
It's interesting. I was reading that wonderful book. I was reading some of the writings by Mo Gauda, who's written a lot on happiness and how we find happiness. And he came into this because he really tragically lost his son. And at one point in the book, he talks about, just desperately trying to understand, just searching for this understanding. And at that moment, into his head came this sort of theme from this game that his son and he used to play. And from that came lots of answers. It was music that made this connection in his mind for him. And I certainly have had that experience of mulling over something that I'm trying to figure out, and then a phrase of music pops into my head, and actually it provides the answer. Yeah. It's just so interesting how our brains work.
Yeah. I'm sure you must be aware of Oliver Sacks' music book as well. I mean, that's just, it's just such an amazing kind of case study, isn't it, for the actual, like you were just saying earlier, the actual kind of transformative kind of healing power of music is just, quite amazing.
Because music is, it's heightened for the musician, and a lot of the emotion that we experience in music is heightened. And it's often simpler because it doesn't have to do with anyone else's relationship. It's just our hearing of the music. And so, the musicians I interviewed described music as taking us to another world, described it as transcendental and just incredibly powerful. So I think getting back to your very, very early point, this is something that educators need to think about, because we don't study music or we don't engage with music in order to be performing at Carnegie Hall.
Some people do.
Some people do.
It's the level that you play.
Well, some people do, and I have, but on a much more important level, everybody should be engaging with music because of the insight it gives them into themselves, and because of what it facilitates in connection with others.
You just reminded me. I was in Vienna actually for a break recently, and we went to a leader recital with Christoph Progadian and Julius Drake, and at the end, they got everyone to sing a lullaby that everybody in Vienna knew. And everybody in the audience was singing this lullaby perfectly in key, perfectly in unison. And I mean, it was just such a magical moment. Just, that engagement with music, it just needs to be. Yeah.
Well, and let's just talk about, how basic it is to be able to sing.
Yeah.
And what that does for us, because when we exhale slowly, it calms our vagus nerve.
Yeah.
It calms that whole system in our body. It's the reaction to the fight or flight.
Okay.
And, so what better way to calm the system than to play the oboe, obviously, which is one long, slow exhale. But all musicians do it. When you stand up on stage, you'll watch a cellist who will take a huge breath in before they bring their bow to the string, and then they will exhale slowly. And they're not doing that because they have to pull the bow across the string. They're doing that because it calms their whole system. Yeah. And so again, these are things we learn when we're playing an instrument, and just the physicality of singing. I mean, I read somewhere that singing in a choir is as good or better for you than engaging with yoga or something similar. So yes, this needs to be a big discussion about the power of music and how important it is. And it's not something that can be cut. It's not a luxury. It's not something extra. It's something fundamental to who we are as humans.
Mm-hmm. I just wondered actually, do you incorporate breathwork into your psychotherapy? I imagine.
Yes, that's a very interesting question, because breathwork is very powerful.
Yes.
It's something that I've thought about integrating, and I may well in the future.
It's a very big thing now.
It's a big thing. And again, it's like music, because when you sort of have a breathwork workshop or a class, you don't have to sit down and talk through the things that are bothering you. You go straight into this breathwork and engaging with the emotion. And so almost the real thing that's troubling you or that you're engaging with comes up, because the big sort of dilemma in therapy is often that the thinking brain can create all sorts of stories for us. So people might say, well, I understand why I don't feel great, but I don't feel any better. And that's because they've made some story up about understanding, which actually isn't touching the truth. So breathwork is a great way into touching the truth. I think therapy can, with the right modalities, can also be an amazing way into that. And as we've talked about, music is a direct hit.
What advice would you give to people who are maybe looking into getting therapy? Because it's such a minefield.
It's like the Wild West, isn't it? To find a good therapist. Well, it's the relationship that heals.
Yeah.
So in your first session, it's a question of how you connect with the therapist.
Yeah.
I personally think that internal family systems is an amazingly powerful modality of therapy. So I always advise to look for somebody who uses internal family systems. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think also, making sure that you have the right therapist as well, because, I think sometimes they can maybe misinterpret you, or, sometimes they might not be very personal. They might actually be quite impersonal. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. It's like, sort of, I think we have a new, there's a new fashion amongst therapists, and many of us think that the relationship is very important, and we're not the sort of old-fashioned analysts who are a blank slate. So that's not what you have to have. Just like we don't expect to go into orchestras and be bombasted by a sort of abusive conductor anymore. We expect these guys to show up and be nice and respectful and have empathy. So I think following your own gut instinct and trusting in your feeling of the relationship, because it is essentially the relationship that will heal. And I think also being aware of what we do in music and how healing that is can be very helpful.
Yeah, well, it's been so lovely talking to you, Emily, and getting to know a bit more about your work. But you and your partner are very well respected classical musicians. You play in the top orchestras, but I know you also have a very busy family life. So how do you look after your own mental health?
That's very interesting. Yes, it tends to get put last because, having children, I sort of feel that they go first. But of course, if you're not well and you're not in balance, it's very hard to parent. So, I've obviously sought out variety, combining, music, a marriage, children, and now psychotherapy means that there's lots of variety. That has its own challenges. I think, bringing the great sort of psychotherapeutic tool of unconditional positive regard and empathy to yourself is probably, that you're not going to get it right.
Yeah.
Even a high percentage of the time. And to recognize that's what it is to be human. It's been very humbling to be a parent and a musician, trying to do all those things. And just to recognize that what that really looks like, especially in this age of sort of curated sort of material. We often see a facade of people. It's very hard to get a sense of what's real, what real looks like, and actually how magical real is. And I think probably under that is getting comfortable. And I think this is something all musicians need to attend to, is getting comfortable with failure. As failure,
100%.
Yeah, failure is as a step towards growth rather than something that's shaming. And because I fail all the time.
So do I. Self-compassion is so important, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, particularly as classical musicians, I think I certainly know that flute players, oboe players, we can sometimes be we could be very perfectionistic, and we like to get things like right all the time, and actually accepting you're not going to be perfect. I think it has to be the way forward. And I mean, I know that both you and your partner have taught at conservatoires. How do you negotiate that then with your students? There can be this kind of master and slave relationship that occurs in conservatoires, and maybe, there can be a much more compassionate and empathetic way towards teaching the pupils. I don't know.
I think definitely compassion has got to be the highest. And, anybody who is trying to make somebody who's come to them for help feel little needs to look inside themselves as to why they might be doing that.
Yeah.
I've just come back from an intensive week teaching at Interlochen, and one of the pupils, we were discussing performance anxiety, and the question came up of, how do you cope when a performance doesn't go well? And I said that I've sort of changed my definition of what a performance going well means for me. With taking orchestral auditions, perfection is, sort of high on our list when we're thinking of how we play an orchestra. But I've really come to view a successful performance as one where I really said what I wanted to say at least once or twice.
Yeah.
And to me, all performances contain mistakes. That's the liberating part of recording. You get to try things again. You get to take real risks and know that you can try to play it as impossibly quiet as you want. And if you fall off that time, you can record it again. So, but in live performance, we've got to know we're going to be safe on that low note or whatever. But if we can really think about what we're saying and what we're communicating, that sort of changes the parameters of a performance. And I've often had the experience of, it's always a compromise being an oboist. Very rarely do the weather and the reeds and the oboe line up, 1,000%.
Yeah, so many variables.
There's so many variables. And as we've discussed, it's one of the beauties of the instrument. But, I invariably find that the days that I show up and I think, gosh, this reed isn't exactly what I want, I try that bit harder, and that's when I see, especially, that I reach the people in the audience, and they'll come up and say, that really said this to me, or I heard this. And so it just is a reminder to me, being an oboist makes us very humble. It's a reminder that, it's not about us. It's about reaching and connection. So what we're looking for, I think, goes a long way to addressing how we feel about our performance.
What's so lovely about watching, you and Daniel, from the videos that I've seen, and, is that both of you, I said this to him when I interviewed him, is that both of you, you really go for it. Like, you really go for the emotion and you really invest and you commit 100%. You just go for it.
Well, I've been so lucky to have our chamber ensemble, London Concord Ensemble, and over the years, recording our Poulenc CD and the Russian music we recorded, and all the chamber projects we've done together. I've been so inspired by every single one of those players who each has a just completely unique sound and goes for it 1,000%. So I've really learned a lot being on stage with those guys. And I think we've all inspired each other. And it's been that wonderful mix of just so wanting to play your absolute best and yet feeling completely safe with your colleagues.
Yeah.
So, and that's magical.
You have both you and Daniel have great stage presence.
Oh, thank you.
Connection. Yeah. And
well, it was great during the pandemic first of all, Dan and I were lucky because we had each other to play with, but then to have this project of getting our YouTube channel set up so that those performances are live and that they're up there, and to be able to record some pieces that really meant something to us and know that those performances are out there. And also I find, when I teach, it's, you can teach the Vaughan Williams concerto, but then, people can go and hear your CD, or they can, go hear your Strauss recording. And it's nice to have those recordings under our belt.
Yeah. Well, everybody go and check out Emily's fabulous YouTube channel, and the Britten video is coming out when?
It will be, yes. So if they sign up on the YouTube channel, then they'll get a notification when it's coming out. It'll be sometime this autumn.
Great. Emily, it's been such a joy and a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
You too. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Talking Classical podcast. I do hope you enjoyed listening. Don't forget you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or other major outlets where you get your podcasts. You can also follow the Talking Classical podcast on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or the Talking Classical blog. If you have a moment, please would you leave a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts, as this will help to increase visibility and get the podcast to more people. Many thanks for listening once again, and I hope that you'll be able to join me for another podcast very soon. Bye for now.